Good morning, everyone. We're going to give everybody some time to get into the meeting, and we'll kick off at about 2 minutes after the hour. I think we still have numbers climbing, so I'll wait until about 2 minutes after, and then we'll get started. Okay. Like the numbers are slowing down. So with that, I'll go ahead and get us started. So hello, everyone. Welcome to Huron's webinar on IRB perspectives related to the NIH data management and sharing policy. A few notes before I introduce our presenters. The webinar is being recorded today, and Primer has confirmed that this webinar is eligible for CIP continuing education credit. Just a note that we'll be launching polls throughout the webinar, and we'll leave room at the end for Q&A, but please stay on mute unless you're asking a question. I'll also be monitoring the chat and Q&A throughout the webinar, so I can address questions as they come up or prompt our presenters to respond at the end. So please do be interactive and feel free to ask questions throughout. We're excited to have your participation on this agenda. So with that, I can move into the topics we plan to cover. So we'll start with introductions. We'll move into our learning objectives. Then Niyati will give an overview of the background of the NIH policy. Then Christina will talk us through the different roles and responsibilities as it relates to the DMSP. And then we'll have some closing considerations and then open it up for Q&A. So with that, let me do some introductions. My name's Candy Loeb, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm based in Denver, Colorado, and have been with Huron for 7 years. I'm a director in our Research Enterprise Solutions capability and one of the leaders of our IRB services team. I'm joined today by Niyati Harneja, who will be kicking off our webinar. She's an associate with the IRB services team. Niyati hails from New York City and has been with Huron for 2 years. Christina Moore will be closing out today's webinar and will be discussing the roles and responsibilities for adhering to the DSMP. Christina is a senior associate with our IRB services team and is located in Northern Michigan and has been with our company for 4.5 years. So again, we'll close with some Q&A. But before we do that, we want to launch our first polling question. And our first polling question, go ahead and get us kicked off here, Niyati. How concerned are you about the DMS policy compliance at your institution? Please select the best answer. And we'll keep it open for a couple of seconds here. All right, we have our results, Niyati. There you go. Generally curious. I'm glad nobody is very worried. But there's definitely a lot to think through as we move into how to comply with this new policy. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and head off camera and head it over to Niyati to get us started. Nancy,
Thanks so much. All right, so it's good to know we're curious. I think we're all in good company here. I'm going to get started with some of our learning objectives before getting into the background and policy. So when researchers collaborate in our data sharing, even small studies with what might seem to be just a little bit of data can serve very important purposes when combined with data from other sources. Our learning objectives today are to explore the background of the NIH data management and sharing policy, as well as the genomic data sharing policy. We'll then move into a deeper dive into the roles and responsibilities of the PI, institution, and the IRB. As Candy mentioned, lastly, we'll explore institutional considerations from practical examples, and then we'll wrap up with a Q&A. The next few slides here will describe the policies and set the stage for understanding roles and responsibilities. So why is data sharing important? Simply put, the act of data sharing leads to breakthroughs. In recent years, data management and sharing have evolved from localized and closed systems to more open and collaborative approaches. This really is due to advances in technology, as well as a growing emphasis on transparency that has led to the establishment of standardized protocols, platforms, and policies that facilitate seamless sharing of research data across disciplines and institutions. Data management and sharing is now a critical part of the scientific research process, enabling faster and more innovative discoveries. And why does the NIH want data to be shared? I've listed many reasons here. The main benefits, though, are to advance rigorous and reproducible research and to promote public trust in research. Increased transparency allows studies to be replicated and reduces duplication of efforts. It can also increase the cost effectiveness of research and maximize research participant contributions for human subject research. The NIH has developed several policies over the years to promote safe sharing and maintenance of data. Their primary goals here are to protect the data as well as to guide researchers. Our discussion today will be focusing on the data management and sharing policy and the genomic data sharing policy, both of which are bolded here. The data management and sharing policy, purpose of which is to promote scientific data sharing, is effective January 25th of this year. It replaces the NIH's 2003 data sharing policy. It applies to all research funded or conducted in whole or in part by the NIH that generates data, regardless of whether the data is used to support scholarly publications. There are, of course, stipulations to the types of data and some exceptions. While the intention of the policy is great, there are, of course, challenges, which we'll get into in a couple of slides. The NIH has a ton of great resources, many of which are linked at the end of this presentation, but this is a high-level overview of the expectations when using this policy. Investigators with NIH-funded projects that result in scientific data must determine if a proposal is subject to the DMS policy. If it is, they must identify methods and repositories for managing and sharing data, as well as develop a plan for managing and sharing data. So here you can see the first step would be planning and budgeting. Considerations are noted below. So thinking about the cost of data and specimen storage, selecting appropriate repositories, plans to obtain funding, identifying the data to be shared, as well as the tools needed to share that data. The next step would be submitting that plan when applying for funding. The DMS plan is required as part of the funding application or proposal. It's then reviewed by the NIH staff. The plan is reviewed prior to the award. There are sample plans available, as well as many templates, and the plan basically serves as an agreement between the institution and the funding source. The expectation is that there will be compliance with this plan, and so the expectation is that there will be compliance with this plan, and so the plan serves as an agreement in making sure that the requirements of the DSM policy are fulfilled. There's support provided and resources for researchers to be able to comply with the plan, and expectations are that this plan will be monitored for compliance. It's important to note that in addition to this policy, there may be additional policies and expectations. Investigators are required to ensure that all expectations of additional funding agencies, local institutions, and other relevant NIH data policy entities are met. The NIH data management and sharing policy outlines considerations for investigators and institutions, as we saw, when developing that plan. Unlike the NIH's genomic data sharing policy, the DMS policy does not mandate the offices or individuals at an institution that are responsible for ensuring compliance with that DMS plan. We'll talk about the genomic data sharing policy for just a couple of slides. This applies to all studies that are funded by the NIH that generate genomic data, no matter how big or small a sample size. Funding institutes or centers may also determine that sharing is required if they see fit. The GDS policy expects investigators generating that genomic data to seek consent from participants for future research uses and broadest possible sharing. With the implementation of that data management and sharing policy, the NIH now requires the GDS plans to be incorporated into the data management and sharing plan, so it's no longer a separate plan. The DMS plan should reflect the anticipated assurances and any limitations identified in the institutional certification. And so what is the institutional certification? Confirms consistency with NIH GDS policy. It affirms that informed consent of participants is sufficient as to allow for sharing of genomic data. It identifies any limitations on the use of data that has been set by the reviewing IRB, and it must be signed by a signatory official of the investigator's institution. I'll talk a little bit now about the challenges with this policy. So first and foremost, balancing data sharing with the need to protect sensitive information and patient privacy can be challenging. Institutions must implement robust security measures to safeguard their data, which can be resource intensive. There may also be conflicts regarding data ownership and intellectual property rights, especially when multiple institutions are involved in a collaborative project. Determining who has the right to share or commercialize data can be a complex issue. Ensuring that data is collected, stored, and shared in a standardized format is crucial for effective sharing, and lack of standardized practices can hinder the data usability. Setting up and maintaining data storage infrastructure, data repositories, and ensuring data are curated properly can be costly, especially for smaller institutions that may struggle with that financial burden. In addition, cultural resistance continues to be a challenge. Some researchers may be reluctant to share their data, and encouraging a culture of open science and data sharing is a continuing evolving area. Some additional challenges are inadequate training and education. Many researchers may not be well versed in data management and sharing practices. Lack of training and education can lead to suboptimal data sharing and management. The NIH policies also may require data to be retained for an extended period of time, and institutions may struggle with long-term data management, particularly when it comes to cost and infrastructure. Navigating the legal and regulatory landscape, including compliance with HIPAA or other data protection laws, can be challenging. Institutions must ensure they adhere to these regulations while sharing data. And while it's great that there are so many policies in place, many of these policies, as we've seen, have changed over the years. This evolution of policies requires institutions to stay current with policy changes and adapt their practices accordingly, which can be effortful. Lastly, coordinating data sharing efforts across different departments, research groups, and stakeholders within an institution can be complex. Communication and coordination are vital to ensure everyone is aligned with the policy. And that segue will take me into our next section, which Christina will lead, talking through the roles and responsibilities within an institution, PI, and the IRB for the data management and sharing policy.
Thank you. As Nithya mentioned, the DMS policy takes a less prescriptive approach for roles and responsibilities than we see elsewhere, like the GDS policy and institutional certification. Let's take a look at the ways data management and sharing considerations fall within the current scope of the PI, institution, and IRB, as well as ways to address potential compliance gaps. 3 concepts were emphasized in the final rule by NIH. The DMS plan should focus on consent considerations, data use, and access. Consent, as we stress to investigators, is a process, not a document. The PI should holistically consider how they communicate with research participants about current and future use of their data, including others who may represent broader community concerns. The plan should outline limitations on future use and include how that information will accompany data being shared. And finally, the PI should consider the level of access appropriate to their data set. The PI may propose justifiable limits to the data sharing requirement for ethical, legal, or technical factors, including participant population considerations, subject safety, where a certificate of confidentiality is deemed to provide insufficient protection, explicit restrictions that prohibit sharing, and impracticability of digitizing the data. NIH would not typically approve a plan that restricts data sharing for unjustified factors. NIH references 3 components to our participant data privacy framework in the supplemental information referenced below. They are de-identification, scientific data sharing and use agreements, and legal protections. According to the common rule, private information or biospecimens are identifiable when the identity of the subject is or may be readily ascertained by the PI or associated with the information or biospecimen. The privacy rule sets a higher bar and includes 18 direct identifiers that must be removed under the safe harbor provision, or the data must otherwise be confirmed through expert determination to be de-identified. The PI must also consider indirect identifiers that may result from qualitative research data. The DUA may be used to communicate any restrictions on data being submitted to repositories, including legal protections, such as the certificate of confidentiality granted for all NIH studies that follow the data in perpetuity. This protects the subjects of the data from any required disclosure. Data submitted with controlled access means data requesters must verify their identity and the appropriateness of their proposed research use to access protected data. NIH encourages consideration of keeping shared data controlled due to the re-identifiability concerns with emerging technologies. Additionally, explicit limitations require controlled access, as would data stigmatizing or sensitive in nature, or where there is a possibility to re-identify. On the other hand, unrestricted access data is publicly available, where explicit consent has been obtained and the institution has confirmed data are de-identified and pose low risk to subjects if re-identified, they may be publicly shared. Once the PI has planned how they will develop their plan in consideration of consent, data use and access considerations, they will draft their informed consent document and submit to the IRB for review with their human subjects research protocol. The primary research informed consent document should disclose how the data will be collected, including any procedures to obtain biospecimens and what is expected to happen to the information downstream. There may be additional sensitivities around data handling, including disposition. The PI should obtain advanced institutional counsel to further inform considerations and be prepared to document community-level permissions to engage the institution in research. The PI should plan for participant withdrawal of consent and refrain from assurances to remove data when it conflicts with regulatory requirements, as we see with FDA-regulated drug and device studies, or after submission of de-identified data to repositories. Cognitively impaired adults, prisoners, and other disadvantaged or vulnerable populations will require additional considerations to mitigate the risk of coercion or undue influence on their decision-making. When research involves children who come of age while still participating in the research, the PI should have a plan to update parental consent with that of the participant. Consent will need to include required regulatory disclosures around future use, genome sequencing, and commercial profit. Consent documents should be plainly written at around a middle school reading level to ensure comprehension and applicable DMSP components. And here we remember that federal regulatory language delineates between the terms must and should. To implement the DMSP, the institution may impose compulsory reviews prior to NIH funding submission, or once awarded, to evaluate the DMS plan. This may be a combination of existing or yet to be determined functions. For example, the IRB will review that communication about future use is appropriate and data confidentiality risks have been considered, while OSP may communicate critical information to repositories via the draft DUA. These processes and requirements are in flux as the regulated community awaits further guidance from NIH. The PI should determine what institutional reviews may apply at their local setting. PI responsibilities under the DMS policy do not end with data sharing. If there are challenges that involve human subject considerations, a modification must be submitted to both the NIH program officer, potentially other institutional oversight components, and the IRB. Okay, so what do we mean by timely? Scientific research data must be shared as soon as possible and no later than the time of an associated publication or the end of the award or support period, whichever comes first. The PI should outline the minimum time frame that scientific data should be made available and comply with that duration or extend it.
All right, so thanks, Christina. We're going to get into our next polling question. Let me just launch that. So how is the responsibility for DMS policy compliance shared at your institution? So here, think about the onus on the PI versus institutional resources, support, review, compliance checks performed by the institution. Select the best answer. So is it that the burden rests heavily on the PI? Is it about split, or does the institution do a lot to support PIs? We'll just give it a few seconds and see if we get a bunch of responses in. Right. I'm going to share the results here. It looks like the majority, the burden does rest heavily on the PI. Some institutions, it looks like it's about split, and some where the institution does do a lot. So it's kind of mixed here.
Okay, now we're going to shift to institutional roles and responsibilities. Data security resources, broadly defined, may be provided by several entities within the institution. Librarians and data managers have robust professional skill sets and tools to help researchers navigate DMS plan development and compliance. They may help identify specific data needed to answer the research question, tools to extract and analyze, and suitable NIH-supported repositories. A data manager serving as an honest broker may serve to de-identify or provide a limited data set from the source. IT and information security help establish institutional policies governing data security and provide tools and support to maintain the institutional firewall, among many other important functions. The DMS policy clearly states it is not designed to set any new standards for institutional data security practices. Research administration may draft agreements with review and will review budget requests to preserve and share data as part of the NIH funding proposal. The signatory or signing official will certify genomic data sharing, and additional compliance functions are likely included. We've examined the various resources and functions in place at many institutions to support data management and sharing. The DMS policy generally references an institutional review process when sharing data broadly, such as through repositories. However, NIH did not intend to address specific features of that process, encouraging instead a robust but flexible approach to institutional review of data sharing. Reviews need only be conducted by those with appropriate expertise and institutional roles. No certification is required. So, who performs the institutional review? One or multiple institutional sign-offs, and I do use that term loosely, may be indicated. This could be an IT or data manager, a representative of the IRB or privacy office. This may be a series of experts representing different departments, or a small number serving the whole institution. Current committee structures could be used or newly created, though the IRB in particular is ever conscious of limiting scope creep. Research administration is certainly a pre-award partner for proposal submission and post-award facilitator of progress reports and closeout processes. However, it's unlikely that award officers have the appropriate qualifications to confirm actual appropriateness of the plan and mitigation of subject risk. This may be a situation where ancillary review functions are introduced and potentially layered throughout the research support and compliance enterprise. The DMS plan must indicate how compliance will be monitored and managed. This is a place where certain entities within the institution may have boilerplate language to provide in a DMS plan template to ensure the accuracy and consistency of submitted plans. Compliance monitoring functions may be carried out by post-approval monitoring entities within the HRPP, clinical trial groups, or even cursory checks against executed DUAs through OSP. So despite the carrot approach in the DMSP, there exists, of course, a stick for findings of noncompliance with the approved DMS plan or actual research misconduct. These penalties may apply to the institution and also to the individual investigator and include closer monitoring, suspension or termination of funding, and unfavorable future funding decisions. Research misconduct may result in debarment from funding, retractions of published articles, and even civil or criminal liability for violations of the False Claims Act. And in the ongoing cycle of support provided by an institution, we have key elements to assure a culture of compliance: continuous evaluation, responsible conduct of research training, and clear communication about requirements surrounding the use of human subject data and biospecimens in research. Institutions should also continue to invest in data security, content experts to support data management and sharing processes, and clear requirements for review and compliance.
Great, thanks, Christina. I'm going to launch another poll now to get a better sense of how your institution handles this. So does your institution have a structured institutional review process to confirm appropriateness of the DMS plan? Here you can select the best answer. So do you have required experts or committee review? You have is it semi-structured where there are resources and consultation, or no, nothing, it's left entirely up to the PI? We'll just give it a few seconds too and get some responses in. Right, I'll share the results here. And it looks like it is pretty split. So some organizations seem to have an expert or committee review or authorization process. In some cases, it's semi-structured, and also some where it's left entirely up to the PI.
We'll conclude this section by outlining IRB responsibilities. The IRB determines the regulatory oversight that applies to human subjects research and performs review against approval criteria on behalf of the institution. IRB review overlaps the DMSP in the following ways: assessment of risk and benefit, including informational harms when data is not kept confidential, consent processes and documentation review, and special population considerations, which positions the IRB to inform certain acceptability standards for data management and sharing. The DMSP is consistent with federal regulations for the protection of human research participants. It is not intended to create new binding rules, but rather should be used by institutions to inform their decisions about whether and how to share participant data. The DMS policy does not change an institution's obligations under the Common Rule, the HIPAA Privacy Rule, or other binding rules. The IRB establishes the regulatory oversight for all human subjects research. Regulations contain unique requirements around consent and data access, use, retention, sharing, and disposition. Certain regulations may be in conflict with others and must be navigated with legal counsel when applied to the same research study. For example, GDPR requirements around right to erasure versus FDA requirements to retain clinical investigation data. The two main overlapping areas between the DMSP and IRB scope involve consent considerations and management of risk. The IRB reviews the consent process and document for consistency, clarity, required content, regulatory disclosures, and to assure voluntariness of the potential participant. The IRB reviews inclusion of special or vulnerable populations against subpart protections, good clinical practice, and research ethics standards. Participant consent may need to be revisited with new information or changes to the previously approved DMS plan. In addition to consent requirements, the IRB reviews all non-exempt human subjects research against criteria for approval outlined in the Common Rule. Of note, risks must be reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits, including the risk of informational harms posed by a loss of data confidentiality, as previously mentioned. The The IRB ensures data are adequately protected in review of the protocol. Evaluation of this standard may be further informed by institutional data security and confidentiality experts and IT policy and procedures. Okay, we're going to spend a bit of time on this slide to examine review considerations for protocols subject to the DMSP. When IRB reviews a protocol to establish a research registry or repository, specific information must be evaluated about how the data or specimens are obtained, storage and access, conditions around linked data, including the identifiers collected, procedures to release data, and terms of consent for future use. Many of these considerations also apply to review of a primary research protocol where data and/or biospecimens may be collected and sent to an established biorepository. Additionally, the data analysis plan and quality control methodology are described, as are steps taken to maintain security throughout management of the data. A primary research protocol must evaluate if results will be shared with subjects under the current research scope and how subject withdrawal will be handled. When studies involve genomic data sharing, institutional certification must be provided after IRB review and approval. Multi-site research investigators have the option to submit a certification for each participating site, or may provide one on behalf of multiple with the assurance that the other institutions meet the expectations and conditions of certification. This path would require coordination among institutional representatives. A secondary use protocol involving identifiable data may qualify for exemption from common rule regulatory requirements. But if the IRB is also serving as a covered entity's privacy board, HIPAA waiver requirements will need to be reviewed and met. For secondary use involving research on identifiable biospecimens, exemption will not apply, and additional consent waiver requirements will be reviewed against impracticability standards. And I should qualify that. Likely will not apply. The originally obtained informed consent document must be reviewed and wherever possible to ensure that there are no stipulations against future use, and must consider whether the new PI has ethical access to identifiers.
Great, thanks, Christina. I'm now going to launch our last poll, and this is really about what's happening with your IRB. So how has your IRB considered DMS policy requirements and guidance during review? Select all that apply. So is it that you have or will review DMS plans before NIH submission, revised IRB submission content, you incorporated institutional ancillary reviews into your IRB approval process, or there has been no change to your IRB review process? I'll give you just a few seconds to lock it in.
And while we're running that poll, we did have a question in the chat about how IRBs are finding or creating capacity for this entirely new practice, the oversight of DMS plans. And I think I just want to clarify here that we're not suggesting that the IRB should be responsible for the oversight of the plans or assessing whether or not the plan adequately meets the NIH standards. Instead, we want to say that the IRB really needs to be taking this plan for data sharing into consideration and making sure that they're assessing those plans in accordance with the 111 criteria for approval. So we don't recommend that the IRB have any additional burden in this process, but instead knowing that there is the plan to share data or use these data in the future or specimens in the future, that we're considering that that information is provided to the subjects appropriately in the consent forms, and also making sure that the protocol explains the plan for maintaining the confidentiality of that data throughout, the life of that data. So not a new burden, not a new practice, but just really taking into consideration that there are going to be plans and requirements for data sharing and future use under this policy.
Great point, Candy, thank you.
Yeah.
So it looks like, based on the results here, a little more than half of attendees have noted there has been no change to the IRB review process, while there are some changes that have been taken, or some changes by the IRB to consider that DMS policy. Right. And we're
All right,
moving
as
on.
we near the end of our webinar, we thought it would be helpful to review an example institutional approach to DMSP implementation, along with key questions for your institution to consider. This is an outline of an example academic medical center's approach to DMS policy implementation and compliance monitoring in human subjects research. You'll see on the green track that this institution utilizes expertise within the university libraries to counsel PIs on plan development and selection of a repository. Department-level security and privacy coordinators regularly meet with researchers to guide development of data confidentiality and security plans that are compliant with institutional policy. This institution is considering adoption of a red flag process to prompt an IRB type of review or consultation pre-proposal submission for highly sensitive research data that has an increased likelihood of being funded. So as you can see, a very small subset, and this process is very much just under consideration, not a Huron endorsed point of view. This would inform DMS plan development in advance of NIH approval and other institutional reviews to not only inform human subject safety issues and trigger other institutional expert reviews, for example, cybersecurity, but also improve efficiency by reducing IRB required changes later in the process. After submission to NIH and notice of award on the yellow track, required institutional reviews are obtained, including IRB and privacy. This is a joint process at many institutions. This is outlined in the orange section. Additional data review may be prompted at this point and may be a required ancillary review to the IRB or a pass-through notification. Once all approvals are obtained and the research is initiated, a data warehouse may be utilized to obtain data from sources like the electronic medical record. The data managers would also provide an honest broker function for research requiring de-identification. As we near the red track near the end of this slide, you'll see that the data are then deposited to, preferably, NIH-supported repositories under a data use and sharing agreement. At this institution, compliance monitoring is provided by the HRPP post-approval monitoring team and clinical trial groups to ensure PI adherence to the terms of their approved DMS plan. And finally, we'll leave you with some food for thought as you return to your home institution. Are there questions you should be asking within your department or more broadly to better support PIs, workflow and review processes, and compliance within the DMSP? And are there ways for the IRB to be advisors to this process given our overlapping area of expertise? We won't read through all of these today, but consider evaluating these questions with your colleagues. We'll conclude with some Q&A prompts, so feel free to come off mute to engage with other attendees. You'll also find links to resources in the appendix. Slides from today's webinar will be circulated with the post-event notice. Thanks so much for your attention today and for the support of our team in delivering this quarterly IRB services webinar effort. And Candy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Niyati. Actually, Niyati, can we back it up a few slides to that process map that we had created? So we had a question in the chat from Becky Gore, and hi, Becky, good to see you on the webinar. And you asked, you didn't think institutional genomic certification was required with this new data management and sharing plan. Is it still required? So Becky, I think there's a nuance there. So there used to be a specific and separate genomic data sharing plan that used to be required. And I know when we were all together at the OHRP forum last month, we understood from the NIH that there's no longer the need for a separate plan. So there's no need to have a genomic sharing plan in addition to your data management and sharing plan. That can all be incorporated under one. But that institutional certification is still required, so that sign-off for the actual deposition of those genomic data eventually. So that's the nuance and that's the difference, but you're right that there does not any longer need to be a separate genomic data sharing plan. So good question. We do have another question that was posted in the chat by an anonymous attendee, and I did want to take the time to talk through it as a group rather than just answer it in the chat. And so The question reads, you talk about the ability to re-identify, and I'm wondering how this works with human specimens. With the exception of some unique tissues like cancerous tumors, isn't it possible to re-identify most specimens through DNA testing? As an IRB member, to what extent should we consider the ability to re-identify either data or specimens to meet with the spirit of this policy? I think that goes back to the slide that Christina was speaking to when we think about the plan for access of the data and how accessible that can be. And so when we think about when you're developing that data sharing plan, and not you, the IRB member, it's really up to the PI to say what is the appropriateness of sharing for these data. And so when we get to the institutional review board process, and you as an IRB member taking that into consideration, it should be in their protocol, the plan for how they're going to share that data. So it's not that you need to review their DMS plan, but instead their protocol. And what does their protocol say about potential future use, sharing, and the potential to re-identify subjects from that information? And I think that's similar to another question that we had in the chat, right? So early on in the process, the PI and ultimately the NIH who accepts the plan need to determine if their plan for data disposition is appropriate, or specimens in this case. And then the IRB needs to consider, is that plan appropriate based on the data that's being submitted, and are there confidentiality measures in place that are appropriate? So making sure that that information is all in the protocol and then also in that consent form. So it's also very important that if your project's generating wide-scale genomic data, or there's going to be identifiable or potentially identifiable specimens being submitted, that the subjects are fully informed as to where their specimens are going, where their data is going, and how those would potentially be used. And I know our friend Leanne from Vanderbilt also asked that question. What do we need to do as part of that IRB review process? And it's all about disclosure, right? And giving those subjects the right to either decline and say, no, I don't want to have my data submitted in that way, or say that's okay. It can be used broadly. So there are options within the consent process. So again, want to reiterate, we're not saying the IRB needs to do anything different from what they normally do in assessing the criteria for approval, but making sure that we know that because the NIH is saying this is very valuable to have these data or specimens used in the future, that we want to make them widely available, that making sure the protocol outlines the plan for making sure that the right confidentiality measures are in place, and that those subjects are fully informed of that process when they're agreeing to participate in the study. So thanks for those questions.
And Kenny, I'll just add to the expectations for data sharing aren't going anywhere. So OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, really anticipates that by 2025, and we've got some guidance in the appendix that we can link to for this, that all federal agencies should have data sharing policies. So the more institutions can think about this broadly to enable compliant and safe sharing, the better, because it's not going away. I think one of our colleagues referred to 2023 as the year of open access. So
thank you, Christine. We have another question in the chat. Tracy, very good question. So Tracy is asking, shouldn't the plan be reviewed by the IRB to ensure congruency with the protocol provisions and consent? I have a big smile on my face because we know that OHRP recently said with the revised common rule that reviewing the grant against the protocol does not offer any additional protections to the subject. So they don't see that as something that needs to fit in the IRB's bucket. But what Christina did mention and what the NIH did say is there should be a process in place for the institution to review that plan. Where your institution decides to put that review is not specified by the NIH. They're sort of getting out of the business of mandating who reviews what. Arguably, I would say in this instance, there is the opportunity to say that reviewing that plan against the protocol for congruency could be helpful, but does not need to be in the IRB's bucket. I try to reduce administrative burden where possible. Ultimately, it's on the PI to implement that plan in accordance with the terms and conditions of their award. And so that should match what they're telling the IRB. But if we need to be a little bit more, tight around those provisions, then absolutely the IRB could review that. But I would press to consider, are there other places that could review that information and not have your IRB in the weeds with congruency, and instead allowing them to focus on the protection of human subjects? And I'm open to alternative perspectives on that if anybody wants to come off mute, or if my colleagues have any opinions on that, because it is not specified, there is no rule. And that's part of what these institutions, or all of our institutions, are dealing with, is how are we implementing these plans? And Neophi, did you want to move forward then to the questions? Yeah. And and Leanne in the chat. Leanne has said, we typically advise labs to perform oversight of their plans. However, NIDDK requires that an institutional official be responsible for oversight. So Leanne is asking, generally, how are universities handling plans submitted to NIDDK? And I'll open that up to the group to see if there's anybody who's willing to come off mute or even want to answer in the chat. I'm happy to read your answer. I don't specifically have examples about how institutions are working with NIDDK. So I'm not seeing any. Oh, there's no option to come off mute. That's interesting. All right. Well, if anybody wants to pop their responses in the Q&A, I'm happy to read those off for the group.
I think I'm able to take people off mute and allow them to talk. I think if you raise your hand, I'm able to do that.
Oh, great. If anybody wants to raise their hand, let's do it. I'd love to hear some new voices today. No, not seeing.
Not seeing.
But Leanne, what I'll say is, again, because the NIH and it sounds like the NIDDK requirement doesn't specify the office individual responsible, then it's going to be up to your institution to make sure that there's the appropriate oversight for that plan. Whether that lives in your IRB, that's up to you. Is it someone in your grants office that's going to be looking at the terms and conditions of the award and making sure that your investigators are following that? And we have seen at some institutions that they can provide the data accession number so that it can be recalled, and that can be added into their progress report during the course of their award period. I suppose that could also be something that's built into the IRB's continuing review process. But again, IRB's charge is to protect human subjects. So if we're really just saying, are you submitting your data in accordance with your plan? Are you maintaining your data in accordance with that plan? That may not be best suited for the IRB office. So those are just some thoughts off the top of my head. I appreciate the thumbs up. All right. Well, we do have about 10 minutes left, but we've gotten through all of our content for today's session. If anybody does want to come off mute or has any final parting thoughts, we welcome that. So I'll pause for just a minute before I have some wrap-up notes. All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and close today's webinar. We really appreciate all of you joining and taking the time to be with us today, especially as folks are still learning how to navigate sort of adherence with and monitoring for compliance with the new NIH policy. So as a reminder, today's session was recorded, and we do plan to send out the slides and the recording to all of you who have attended. You'll also be receiving a brief survey, so we welcome your feedback and really look forward to any information that you have for us. A reminder, this was eligible for CE credit, so you all will be able to count this towards your continuing education. And if any of you have any questions or want to be kept in the loop with future webinars, please feel free to reach out to any one of us who presented today. We'd be happy to get you on our listservs. But with that, I hope you all have a great Halloween. Thanks so much to my presenters. You all did a great job today. And we look forward to seeing you for another webinar in the future. Have a great day.